Okay, I think we'll get started. It's absolutely fine if people wander in a few minutes later. In fact, one more person. I often run sessions myself, so I have no position to be looking at people. I'm Eoin Woods. I'm the CTO of a company called Endava, an IT services provider. So many companies are, 2,000 of us. I've been working with security since, I suppose, the early 2000s, when I worked in internet security in particular. We'll talk about that in a minute. We're going to talk today, about 90 minutes, about security. The thing that may surprise you, or maybe if you've read the abstract you expected, we're not going to talk very much about security technology. We do have a slightly longer version of this talk, where I talk a little bit more about the technology, but my very strong thesis, which the entire security industry I think agrees with, is that if you don't get the fundamentals right, you end up using a lot of security technology and not being very secure, which is the worst possible outcome. So we're going to talk today about all the things you need to do before you worry about which is security technology you're going to run to solve the problem. It's a fairly small session, which is really good. We don't like the big ones we can't see them. So please interact with me through. If you disagree with me, you tell me. I'm very open to being disagreed with. All the engineers in the Endava disagree with me regularly. And if I'm asking a question, it's not rhetorical, just jump in with an answer. It's much more interesting for everyone. So to start with, security is quite difficult, but it's also quite important. I have this view, dealing with some of our clients, many large industrials have absolutely no idea of the cybersecurity threat they face today. My thing I always say to them is, you think you're secure because you haven't yet annoyed Anonymous. The day you annoy the Anonymous collective, you'll find out how good your IT security is. You think you're secure because you're catching a certain number of attacks on your boundary from people who don't care very much, because you're not really under sustained attack. And the reason this is becoming more important is, as our head of digital likes to say, every company today is a digital firm. I mean, who here hasn't got a website? That is a rhetorical question. I know you've all got public-facing websites. And they're getting bigger and more important, so more services are hanging on the public internet, so security is becoming much more important. What I observe, though, time and time again, and this is not in the last couple of years, this is for well over a decade, is that when I work with development teams, they often start with the security technologies rather than asking questions about the security of the system. So when I ask people about security, they say, I'm using single sign-on and we're going to use Spring Security. None of which is necessarily wrong. In fact, they're probably both good decisions in the right context. But they don't tell me very much about whether the system is secure or not. And there's also, even among security professionals sometimes, there's a fixation with tools around the software development lifecycle. Does anyone here use Fortify, for example? FXCop? .NET must use FXCop, yeah. Tripwire, Find Bugs, all those kind of tools. Again, many of them are very good. They've got a lot to offer, but they're not the be-all and end-all of checking your system secure. Any security expert, and I'll tell you in a minute, I'm not really a security expert. I kind of bluff my way as a security expert. I'm really a systems architect who's now a CTO. Any security expert will say is, you need to figure out what risks you face, and then you figure out how to mitigate the risks. And it's at that point you worry about the technology. Nearly all teams I talk to, when I ask them, Spring Security is great, I think very solid bit of technology, what risk are you mitigating? They do look at me a bit blankly, and they go, well, we were told it had to be secure, and we had to control it, so we've used Spring Security. But there may be any number of risks they're facing that Spring Security is utterly irrelevant for, or maybe they're using it in a way that doesn't address them. So technology is important, it's only part of the solution. And in this talk, we're going to talk about risk-driven security. The caveats are, it's a pretty introductory talk. No one's going to leave here as a qualified security engineer. I'm sure you weren't expecting that. In fact, I'm not a well-qualified security engineer. As I say, I'm a software architect. I do think, though, that means that I can communicate with you about security in a way that often security teams don't. How many of you work in a firm with a specialist security unit, where you've got IT security people, and when you talk to them, how does that communication generally go? That's not a rhetorical question. Because in my experience, it doesn't tend to go very well, because often IT security people have got a view of the world, because they're real experts. They've been doing this stuff for decades, and they're qualified in it with lots of specialist qualifications. And developers know security is kind of important, but frankly, they've got a system to ship, and the two teams tend to talk past each other. And that's one of the things that people like me are trying to bridge the gap a bit, along with many more famous people than me, like Adam Shostak, is doing a great job at that as well. So what is security? Security is about having dependable systems. And we need systems that are dependable in spite of the fact that, good morning, malice, error, and mischance exist in the world. Or to put it in a snappier way, people are bad, stupid, or unlucky. And security is how we mitigate the risks of people being bad, stupid, or unlucky having a bad effect on us. The key point is that anything of value in your system, that's of value to anyone, may attract unwelcome attention. Clearly, if I was to leave £500 in £10 notes here, and I left it, now all of you clearly would hand it to security immediately, but if I just left it in an empty building and came back a week later, the chances of it still being here are slight. That's because it's of value. It's much the same with websites. One of the things I say to big corporates is, one of the reasons you may not be seeing all that many attacks is because today there's not a tremendous value in attacking you. And so we try and look at the value of resources to people to figure out what kind of unwelcome attention it might get. And we care about this because all of these things imply some kind of a loss. Time, as in time out of a market, money, people stealing stuff, privacy, talk to Sony, people leaking information they really didn't want to share with the rest of the world. In fact, clearly their CEO didn't want to share it with the rest of the company, never mind the rest of the world. Reputational damage, again Sony, but lots of big banks are quite concerned about this. If they have a website defaced, what does that say about their IT security? It's a big reputational impact. And finally, gaining an advantage over somebody. Does anyone know, in fact you may all have read about it, but what's one of the classic attacks on an auction system, like eBay, that requires no security knowledge, no security hacking, no special technology? And it's about gaining advantage in the auction process. What's one of the best attacks on a naive, anyway, auction system? Bingo. Yes. Simply trying to use people's accounts with dummy passwords to lock their accounts, and then hoping that they will have to relog into the system in some way. Of course, after many password attempts, systems often invalidate cookies anyway because they think something's going on. Somebody tries to log back in, and their account's been locked. Now, if you time that right in an auction, and it's the person bidding against you whose account that you've tampered with, you've gained an advantage. And arguably, you've gained money and time as well, and those things. But a key thing is you've gained an advantage in an interaction between two people. And that's not a very sophisticated attack. Back when I worked in the Bay Area during the boom, that was one of the problems eBay had early on. They didn't have a good mitigation for that, and some people figured it out very, very quickly. And there was a huge spate of people attacking eBay, who now I think have got very sophisticated mitigations against that attack, as other auction sites do too. But in the early days, when we were all a bit naive, that was a very successful attack. So security is the business of managing these risks, and it's really a type of insurance. I mention that because that's the analogy you use with especially your business managers, when they're saying, this all looks a bit complicated and expensive, couldn't we just not do so much of this? And you say, yes, we could do less of this, and then we'll run more risk. And I always just say to people, do you have house insurance? Because it's an unpleasant bill that comes through the post once a year, and you have to pay quite a significant amount of money. If they're a senior manager, after all, presumably they've got a big house, so they'll have a big insurance bill. Do they pay their bill? Of course they do, because they want to mitigate the risk. It's the same with building security into your systems and development processes. It's balancing cost and effort, which we don't like, against the risk of loss, which we also don't like. So we've got to balance those two. And some of, this goes back to the fact security people are kind of in their own little world. There's a number of key terms which I'll use this morning, though I'll keep explaining them if you need me to, but security people often don't explain them. The four key things are resources. That's the stuff people care about. That's things of value normally. They need protection. There are actors, and they're also called principals. Those are sort of substitutable. Principals or actors, they're the people or things that interact with the system. They can be good or bad, depending on their motivation and maybe their context. Some of them may be good some of the time and bad others times. Policies are the rules you'd like to enforce, such as no one else can see my email. That's a policy. Well, that's a rule in a bigger policy, I would think. And finally, the threats, which is what we're really going to talk about this morning, that's the reason that people may break the policy rules, and that's how the policy rules might get broken. After all, in a perfect world, what would you do? If everyone was entirely honest, You'd simply write the policy down and give it to people, and then they'd follow it, because it's a perfect world. We know that doesn't happen, and that's why we need security. And the reasons the policy may get breached, those are called threats. And we're going to talk a lot about threats this morning. Security is multidimensional. I'm sure this isn't any news to you, but it's about people, process, and technology. The reason, again, I mention this is saying I'm using SSL and I've got a firewall is all fine, providing you've also assured that your people aren't a huge vulnerability and your processes aren't a huge vulnerability. One of the vulnerabilities, I think, for services firms, for example, is they employ many, many people, normally in many, many countries, sometimes under complicated subcontract relationships, and yet they are warranting to their customers that security is good. That means there's a tremendous reliance on making sure your people are trustworthy and your processes that the people follow are enforced and are secure. So it's not just about bits of technology. And have you heard of Bruce Schneier? You must have heard of Bruce Schneier. Probably the highest profile man in the security industry. To be unkind to him, you'd say he's a talking head, but he's a lot more than that. He used to be a cryptographer. I think, in fact, he might even be ex-NSA. He's now a huge critic of the NSA, and a lot of what they stand for. But he's thought very deeply about security for many years and written a number of the classic, certainly opinion books. And his quote from many years ago is, "Security is not a product, it's a process." And the reason he said that was there's a lot of companies will try and sell you a product and tell you that this will make you secure. And Schneier's point is that's impossible. It may be a useful building block in security, but a product will never make you secure by itself, because you're as strong as the weakest part of the puzzle. So we talked a bit about threats. There's an organisation called OWASP that I will mention right through this talk. It's the Open Web Application Security Project. I just about remember that. They're always called OWASP. And do go and look at their website. It's really very good. It's full of resources, including this picture, which just kind of is a useful visualization of how the concepts fit together, in that you have the agents, actors, principals over here, people who may be a threat to you. They have ways into your system. Those are, in the jargon, are called attack vectors. And you have weaknesses in your system. I can say that categorically, knowing nothing about your systems, because every complex system has weaknesses. So the attack vectors exploit the weaknesses to break the security controls, which are enforcing the policy, to get at some resource. And they break their resources out into assets and functions. And the whole point of this, the reason it's a problem, is over here, is that has an impact on someone. So if you're a large company and you lose a lot of customer data, it means that people no longer want to use your web store. That has a pretty big business impact. And there's just a recap of the words at the bottom of the slide, which I've talked enough about them. I'll move on. So what do we actually need from security? The key things that people actually want when they mean security are normally these four things. They want confidentiality, which is often called privacy, keeping things safe, keeping things private, keeping things secret. So that's the you can't read my email property. They want integrity, which is knowing that things haven't been tampered with. And this is a big challenge in IT systems. How many of your corporate systems, you don't put your hands up, it's on video, how many of your corporate systems do you have DBAs who effectively have unrestricted access to production databases because of the production environment? It's very, very common. It's very hard to control. It's very hard, in fact, to guarantee integrity under that situation if that's important to you, because unless you go out of your way to in some way put extra data in there, normally called signing, which I don't talk a lot about today, but unless you sign the data so it can't be tampered with, it's very hard to be sure a DBA didn't change something. People want their systems to be available, and this is the classic distributed denial of service attack problem for internet-facing systems. If people take a dislike to you, they will try and knock you off the internet. Have you all looked at those quite frightening public-facing websites that track denial of service attacks? I mean, they're quite fascinating. If you just type DDoS map into Google, there's 2 or 3 well-known ones. Arbor Networks run one of the really well-known ones. I mean, that is quite sobering as to how many denial of service attacks are going on all the time, every minute of every day. It's not an occasional phenomenon, it's routine. I have a little virtual machine, sits on DigitalOcean. I have another one at Bytemark, private things, just £10 a month kind of service. They don't have public DNS. I'm the only one that knows the IP addresses, and I have private DNS inside my network to allow me to bind to them. Do you want to hazard a guess as to how many SSH attacks those machines get a day? Remember, they're not on the public internet. There's nothing on them of any value. They get dozens to hundreds, depending on the time of year. It waxes and wanes, which is fascinating too, as to why it waxes. I have no idea why it waxes and wanes. And the only port I've got open is 22. Only way into those machines is SSH. It's got no default passwords. You can't log in as root. There's nothing there to steal, and yet they're attacked dozens of times a day. So if you've got a big internet-facing property which actually has some value in it, think how often you're being attacked. So the availability of the system is something that is very fragile. And finally, accountability. We don't want people to be able to deny what they've done. Yes, sorry.
I just want to call out those attacks on your machine.
Yes.
Do you suspect most of them are automated attacks?
Almost certainly, yes, just because of the sheer volume. I don't think. I don't think so. No, they're scanning IP ranges. They've found just probably via ping, nothing more sophisticated than that the IP is live. They've then found there's a port open. They've just had a go. In fact, the reason I picked them up is because I don't actually use an IDS because there's not enough on the machines to care about. I'm picking them up in the SSH failed logins log, and I have a little automated scanner runs every day, just totals them up for me, puts them in a file, and once a week emails me the horrifying summary, summarising by country. That's the other interesting thing is which country. They're mainly from China and Russia. No great surprises maybe, but I've also had many attacks, hundreds from the UK, which did surprise me. I didn't think there were that many people doing port scanning to machines of no value in the UK. And the accountability point, we don't want people to be able to deny what they've done. And that goes back a bit to this DBA in production problem. If they do change data, you want to know about it. So securing systems. 4 steps to securing a system, or 4 stages. You need to understand your system. That sounds self-evident, but how many of you work on quite a big system? How many of you have got 500,000 lines of code or more? 250,000 lines of code, that sort of sense? Yeah. Your systems are probably big enough you can't fit them in your head. Would I be right? Certainly not all the detail. I mean, if somebody asked you tomorrow, this is always my nightmare when I worked for a very large bank for quite a long time, people said, how many, which remote systems do you connect to? Well, we kept this huge spreadsheet and tried to keep up to date, and we scanned the code, but we always forgot one. Yeah, we were connected to dozens of other ways, and every one of those is potentially an attack vector in or out. So understand the system. It's not as simple as it sounds. I don't talk a huge amount about that this morning, but we'll briefly touch on that. Then into the security. We need to analyse the problem so we know what kind of security we need, and we understand what problem we're really solving. And there's 2 bits to that we'll talk about when we get there. And then once we understand the problem, we can mitigate it. Mitigation being another security bit of jargon, means fix the problem. There's 2 things we do here. We minimise the attack surface, which actually we probably do far earlier, kind of when we're building a system, but logically it fits here in the security model. I'll talk about that later. That means giving people less to attack. And then we build countermeasures, which this talk's not primarily about countermeasures. If you get the slides from the website, there's an appendix of standard countermeasures. I'm sure there's nothing new to any of you in there, but they're just a bit of a catalogue should you want to refer to them. And then finally, test. You've got to validate that actually this process was useful. And so you need to review what you've done, especially with experts who've maybe done this more than we have, and you need to test. Again, a combination of your testing and probably third-party testing. If you've got a public website, do many of you use third-party penetration testing teams? So you've got third-party companies who come and whack it for you. That's a really good idea. Because again, they're far more on top of the realistic threats than people like us are, because that's what they do for a living. But on testing, that's not a cop-out for not testing internally, clearly. We'll talk about what you could do, but there's a lot to do internally before you unleash a pen test team on it. So, step 1, understand. I'll sort of gloss over this a bit, because it's not, in a sense, that much to do with security. It's a hard problem, which I guess people like myself and Simon Brown and Kevlin and many others have talked quite a lot about how you understand systems and how you model them and what's important to focus on and what's not. The 2 things you need to understand for a security model are the core functional architecture of the system, so what I would call a functional view, and you need to understand its context, the environment it sits within. The reason being the context is where the threats emerge, and the impact of the threats is directly related to how the system works internally. what kind of things would you focus, suppose you don't have any models, what kind of things would you focus on when you were trying to understand your current system from a security perspective? What would you look for? We talked a bit about them earlier, we mentioned them in passing. When we talked about attack vectors, the key thing you're really looking for is data flow through the system and the external connections. And it's where it's possible to make an external connection, not just your normal external connection that people actually connect into. There have been many, many attacks over the years, for example, on data center equipment, because the main entry and exit points in and out of the equipment were very highly secured. And then there was always a special backdoor to allow maintenance engineering to get into it via console connection, or maybe via a leased line, or via an IP address, or whatever it was. And you know, that wasn't nearly so well secured. And that was a very common way in. So it's remembering that you draw your context diagram for, managers or for people testing the system or whatever. It's got a very functional kind of spin to it. You do need to go back and add all of the other ways into the system that you know about. Oh yeah, because actually, if we put files in this directory, of course, we've got the support mechanism that loads the files into the database. Better go and have a look at that, because that's a way in as well. It's just not one we talk about with our end user community. So that's all I'm really going to talk about modelling it, but those are the two views I think you need, and the way, and what you're keen to know is how many ways into the system are there, and what are the fundamental data flows. So then when you're analysing, we then move on to the analyse step, and there's two bits to that as we talked about, resources and policy, and threat modelling. So resources, this is sort of self-evident, right? You need to know what's valuable in your system that might make someone attack it, because then that's going to get you thinking about how might they attack it, because if that's what the resource they're after. What's valuable is quite often self-evident. If you've got payroll data in your system, if you've got transactions, if you've got orders, all of those things may be of value to someone. If you've got your company accounts, for example. But, so classic here would be in the financial services industry, which is where all my examples come from because I worked there for 10 years. Client information is hugely valuable and hugely damaging if you lose it. It's of both direct value in itself, it can be sold, make no mistake about it, it's of value to people, but also it's very damaging because your regulator will have made you sign up to lots of regulations, one of them being there's full disclosure of loss of client data. You've got to tell your regulator within a certain number of hours of finding your client data's on the loose. This is why these days, have you noticed that there's been a lot more reports of credit cards being stolen from websites? It kind of pops up, especially if you read the security press like SC magazine. It's quite common now you see somebody fessing up to credit cards gone. The reason for that is because now companies realise not reporting it is a bigger risk than reporting it. So people are now starting to put their hands up and go, we've lost some credit cards, sorry. As opposed to before they kind of went, we've lost some credit cards, let's see if anyone notices. And that's now no longer acceptable. And big banks in particular will have a tendency to take them off their merchant lists if they think they're concealing loss of credit card details. So has anyone here had one of those phone calls from the bank? We're really sorry about this, but we've just cancelled your card. You've done what? Well, we think your credit card number's been cloned, stolen, abused in some way. Those are, quite often a result of there's a disclosure, it goes into the Visa and MasterCard groups, they tell all the issuers go, what, again? And, then start cancelling the cards. However, that's kind of obvious. You'll all find that. The thing that you need to think about slightly more broadly when you're doing security analysis is who might find stuff of value? Because there's stuff that you may not think is very valuable, but actually other people might find of value directly because it's of value, or indirectly because it's what's known as security people call a stepping stone, meaning it's a step on the path to getting something valuable. I'll give you a real-world example of this, which makes me look a twit. So I can tell you about it because it doesn't make anyone else look a twit. So in a previous life, I was having a bit of a debate with a number of people about why we didn't use public cloud for our development and test environments. So we weren't going to put production data in it because we weren't allowed to put that in our test environments anyway. So I was arguing that really the risks are very low, the code is not that valuable, we can put a VPN in place across Amazon, normal kind of arguments. And then actually somebody, who wasn't even a security engineer, so I probably should have thought of this, pointed out, well actually, the thing that we do upload is all of our configuration data. Well, it's true, I said. And suddenly the penny dropped. Of course. If you're a potential attacker for a large organisation, the internal topology of their network is utter gold dust, as are things like even dev and test security credentials, because they allow you to navigate through the network. And given that many networks don't physically separate production and development, it can give you a launch pad to launch an attack on production. So actually, your configuration files, and that's only one example, but your configuration files can be tremendously valuable to someone else, whereas you think of them as configuration files. And, I mean, we just store them in source control, generate them, they're of no interest to anyone. Oh, well, actually, they might be, just not to someone who's legitimate and inside the firm. The other thing is that finding resources isn't that difficult, but we do need to drill to another level of detail, which is what we mean by the actions on the resources or the operations. And the reason I mention this is because you quite often see people producing very good lists of entities, in effect, things in their data model or things in other systems, and not thinking about what levels of control do we need on this. They just sort of list it once. A classic and trivial example, you will have much cleverer examples in your systems, are payments. Within the company, it's one thing to allow people to view a payment schedule. It's quite a different thing to allow someone to release a payment for translation to a SWIFT message to go out to a banking network. Clearly, those are very different levels of risk, and you would almost certainly want different levels of authorization to do that. And inside call centers and customer service centers and so on, this is quite a big thing. I know someone who he's a solution architect, so he sort of builds call centers out of components. And one of the things they're constantly running up against is vendors of different packages. You've got slightly different security models, and trying to make sure that they don't inadvertently build in a security inconsistency that allows a relatively low-level member of staff to do things like cancel orders, refund money, apply credit for bad customer service. All things that people need to do on a very regular basis, but not things you want to be uncontrolled, whereas you actually want to give them access to all the information. The other thing is you have to drill into if you're sort of entity-driven, make sure you drill into the detail. HR data, obviously, somebody's work mobile number is not very sensitive, their home address is pretty sensitive, or their medical history or anything like that. So drill a little bit beyond the obvious. So I'm sure that won't be any great problem. And then once you've got a list of the stuff you care about, the next thing to figure out is, how do I want to control it? And really, policy is just a posh name for specification. Security people love to think up their own words because they want to be precise. And they also, I'm sure they want to make it sound far more difficult than it really is. So they talk about policy, and what they mean is a spec. It's the controls and guarantees in the system, which is typically relatively straightforward. It's who can use the system, so what kinds of people use the system, roles typically, is how it's manifested in software. What will they work on? So that's the resource types. I mean, I can work on the customer record, I can work on orders, and I can work on payments. Or I can only work on orders and customers, or I can only work on payments, those kind of questions. And then what can they do? Our example from before. I can see all the orders, but I'm not allowed to cancel one for credit. I have to get somebody with different authorization, a different department to do that. Or maybe it requires someone to approve it, or whatever the policy is. So simple policy is often done via pretty straightforward, tables, graphs, lists. I show this simply because it's not terribly interesting, but the whole point is it's not terribly interesting. Stating policy is not typically very difficult. I don't know why people don't do it more often, because I think sometimes defining the security policy sounds hard, whereas writing down the spec doesn't. So that's the thing to go back and say to your teams. Just write the security spec down. And then we get on to the stuff that is perhaps a bit more interesting. So threat modeling. So threat modeling is a key technique in security engineering, as it would broadly be termed. Threat modeling is, so firstly, threats are those possible breaches in security, which we talked about before. Every system's got vulnerabilities. That's a given. And attackers have motivation and goals. Otherwise, they're irrelevant. If they have no goals related to your system, you don't care about them, they're not an attacker. And even if they have a goal, if they don't have the right level of motivation, really, they're not an attacker. A threat is when an attacker, that's somebody who's got motivation and goals, collides with a vulnerability. and now you've got a threat on your system. If any one of those pieces is missing, you haven't really got a problem. The big thing that has perhaps changed, especially the internet era, is unfortunately how the internet allows motivated people who wish to do you harm to connect to you. Whereas, of course, before quite such open public networks, there may have been motivated people who had time on their hands who wished to do bad things to you, but they couldn't connect to you. Whereas now, because they'd used dial-up on Reuters or Swift or whatever it was, which was too expensive. Whereas now, thank goodness for the internet, it's allowed all these people to find you directly and attack you. It's made attacks much more efficient. Hence the automated denial of service attack we talked about a few minutes ago. Those people have no interest in me really, but the internet has enabled them to make my life 1 degree harder. And so we've got to figure out what these threats are, and that is the core of security design, is figuring out what your threats are. Yeah.
Now, I ask you on that. I mean, that makes sense to me, of course, but now as well we have the problem with people who just like to watch the world burn, because
Indeed.
It may not be a goal, but it just might be
just cause. Well, to be honest, I think that's a goal. I mean, I think there's plenty of, I mean, it's what I dismissively refer to as script kiddies.
Yeah.
You know, the hackers that are not very highly skilled, that they're not going to be accepted into anonymous. But, well, I think they've got a goal too, which is to have fun and make mischief. And it's just as valid a goal, if you like. It's just that it's kind of annoying because there's no real value for them at the end. It just makes them feel better about themselves. And yeah, I mean, I think you have to, especially today, I mean, another thing I'm seeing emerge is, so 5, 7, 10 years ago, I think script kiddies existed, especially universities then were a bit naive about what they let students get access to. On the other hand, they didn't get very far because actually they were sort of building all their tools themselves. By definition, they weren't tremendously skilled. It wasn't very hard to block the kind of attack that they engaged in. And there was a small hardcore number of hackers in, you know, I don't want to put people in pigeonholes, but there certainly were plenty in Russia who were very skilled, possibly ex-military from high-grade technical universities, and they were the real problem. The snag today is that hacking knowledge has become industrialized. Just as 20 years ago, we didn't have well-packaged, you know, .NET type runtimes to look after garbage collection for us, and now we have. 20 years ago, we didn't have well-packaged security hacking devices, which are now available for relatively small amounts of money, a couple $100, not even always via darknets. And some of them are, I'm told. I have to be careful which ones I go near so I don't get blacklisted, but I'm told that there are definitely, it's not very hard to get hold of a very sophisticated bit of hacking kit for hundreds of dollars, and then how easy is it now to get 100 VMs to run it on? It takes you moments. And especially with DevOps and continuous delivery, we're really making it easy for people to spin up hacking farms. So it's just, it's a bit like the old argument about steel that can be used for nice sharp knives or making tanks. You know, we've built all the tools to make hacking industrial scale. And this unfortunately means we've got to be a little bit careful about dismissing script kiddies. It's not very hard for them, with very little to lose in terms of their reputation and everything else, to get themselves to the point where actually they can be more than just a bit of an annoyance. They can be a danger. They may not, in fact, they may not really know what they're doing, but they can certainly bring down a public website just by fiddling around. And it's certainly something I've personally had to recalibrate a bit when I've seen just how sophisticated and well packaged many of the hacking tools today are. I mean, they really are not much more than point and click or, you know, make install. It's quite frightening. Let's expunge those thoughts so we can all sleep again. So identifying threats, that's the key thing that we're trying to do. So threat modeling, it's a well understood technique. Before you came to this talk, had you all heard of threat modeling? Is that why you all come? Actually, do put your hands up. Roughly how many heard? About half. Yeah, great, thank you. So threat modeling has been around for years and years and years. And it tends to be wrapped up in a lot of mystique. And it tends to be corporate security groups tell you that they are going to engage in a threat modeling exercise on your resources. Gosh, you think that sounds unpleasant. I really wish you wouldn't, or if you did, that you didn't have to involve me. But actually, threat modeling is actually quite straightforward. And there is a fantastic guy called Adam Shostak who works for Microsoft. You may have come across him. He wrote a book in 2014 called Threat Modeling. And he has masterminded Microsoft's threat modeling program. And Adam's fantastic. He's a dyed-in-the-wool security expert, been doing security for many, many years, has been in that whole security community, but he's very much trying to bridge the gap, because that's what Microsoft hired him to do. It was, our developers don't know how to build secure software. But he went, get away. But they said, we're serious about fixing that. Right, he said, you need a threat modeling exercise right through the firm. And Microsoft's response was, well, come and work for us. Do it. here's the money. So I guess he said, oh, that's rather called my bluff. But he's done it. And they've now got a terrific threat modelling culture in the firm. The point about threat modelling, as Shostak makes eloquently in his book, is although it can be complicated, it's no more complicated than building systems. And it's well within the grasp of any mainstream developer if you strip away all the mystique. Because all it is, and this is almost definition, it's a procedure for optimizing, really achieving security by figuring out what your objectives and vulnerabilities are and then finding the countermeasures. That doesn't sound too hard, does it? And actually, it's not terrifically hard. And we've got to take threat modelling away from the security specialists and have general software teams feeling confident about doing it. The point about it is, it identifies risks and focuses your effort. Because there's far too many things to possibly secure. Threat modelling is about finding the stuff that you really need to focus on. Shostak's got a great analogy which I really like, which is how many people in software teams are dyed-in-the-wool experts on software configuration management? Probably not that many, really, but they're competent in using Team Foundation Server or Git or Subversion or even ClearCase, God help them. They know how to use a system operationally, they've read enough about it, they're perfectly competent, and they're very confident in using it. Now, if somebody then said, could you set up source control for a 500-man project with lots and lots of complicated interdependencies between modules, and we need to release it in 3 different versions on 2 continents and 4 languages, they'd probably go, no, that's not for me. I can do my job, but that's not for me. Threat modelling should be the same. We should all go, yeah, of course I can threat model. And if somebody says, would you like to set up threat modelling for Microsoft? You go, no, that's not for me. You want to call Adam Shostak. He can do that kind of stuff. But there's really no reason why teams shouldn't feel quite confident about doing it themselves. And sure, there's limitations to your knowledge, but if you get into something really complicated with Team Foundation Server, what do? You get a consultant, right, who comes in for a period, gives you a hand, figures out where you went wrong, gives you some advice, mentors you a bit, moves you on. Just the same with security. If it just gets a bit complicated, that's fine. There are lots of experts out there who will come in and give you a hand. So threat modelling pictorially, you've got to figure out who's going to attack your system, what their goal is, and what vulnerabilities they might use in order to achieve that. I couldn't resist a picture because I found these cute icons on Icon Finder. Have you heard of Alice and Bob? You must have heard of Alice and Bob. So security people like to have named actors in all of their scenarios when they're explaining them to people. And there are certain very standard ones. Alice and Bob are good actors. So they're always virtuous people who are using security for the good of the world. Eve's a bad actor. Boo, hiss. Whenever you see Eve, you know problems are ahead. Eve is an eavesdropper. And normally Eve tends to be an insider, and they're not always. But she's an eavesdropper, that's the key thing. So she's bad, she's not for the good of the world, she's a nasty woman, and she attacks by listening in on transmission, typically, in scenarios. And there's another very well-known one. Have you heard of Mallory? Mallory's really bad. He's normally painted black. He's so bad. He's an attacker who's got malicious aims, hence Mallory, because he's malicious, and he's not an eavesdropper. He's typically a brute force attacker or a crypto cracker, something like that. So when you see these, when you talk to security people and they talk about Alice, Bob, Mallory, and Eve, they're not random names. They're trying to communicate with you in a rather flawed way because they never explain it. What they mean is, if they say Alice and Mallory, they mean good person, bad person. So that's just a tip for next time you talk to corporate security. So in this case, really simple threat modelling here. Alice wants to send Bob an encrypted document. She's going to send it by using a secret key. I realise you probably wouldn't do this, but bear with me. I only had a small amount of slide. So she wants to use a secret key. She will send the document to Bob, and then out of band, as security people would say, via some other mechanism, she will transmit the key to Bob. Eve wants to read the document. She's an opportunist, insider, and the vulnerability is the key has been sent to Bob via an unprotected channel. Now, clearly that's highly unwise, although how many of you have sent bank details with a sort code and an account number together to somebody via email? I did that a number of times a number of years ago until I suddenly went, that's a really stupid thing to do. So at the very least, you send 2 emails ideally from separate email accounts so that the 2 are unlikely to be correlated in any way in transport. So this is an example of a bit of threat modelling. So we've got Eve's an eavesdropper. Her goal is she wants to read that document. The vulnerability is Alice has sent Bob a key over some channel, which just means transmission, over some channel which is unprotected. Therefore, Eve, if she intercepts the key, can read the document. You see, threat modeling is not very hard. It's hard necessarily to know when you're done, but the basics of threat modeling are not hard. That's fundamentally all it is. But it is valuable, because now you know you've got a real threat against a real resource with a real potentially motivated attacker. You've got something to go and fix. It's worth fixing, because that will cost money. So where do you find these threats? Actually, that's the tough bit. Finding the threats and having any idea that you're done. It's particularly hard to know you're done, but even figuring out where the threats might come from. So again, this is Microsoft, I think, came up with this. They certainly use it very widely, but I think they came up with it. So they came up with an acronym, STRIDE. And they said, well, there are fundamentally 6 types of threats that most information systems tend to face. They face spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privilege. And let's just talk about each of these briefly. Spoofing is pretending to be someone or something you're not. So a classic example there would be in the web, doing what with a session cookie? Intercepting and reusing somebody else's session cookie. Pretending to be a user you're not. Tampering, that's just changing information you shouldn't. That's that DBA who's having a little tamper in the transaction column of some table and doing something they really shouldn't. See, tampering can vary hugely from... there was a very interesting disclosure recently from Google that they have managed to break into, or they've done a proof of concept attack on Linux systems, though they'd work on Windows, incidentally, just as well. They just started on Linux, by bombarding memory of a certain type, certain kind of DRAM, with a tremendous number of read operations for a period. They caused bits to flip incorrectly, but deterministically. And through that, they got into a bootloader and managed to subvert the operating system. Apparently, the chip manufacturers have known about this for 5 years. Apparently, they just kind of went, yeah, no one's going to do that, are they? We'll just keep quiet about it. So then Google found it and kind of told the world. So it's very widely used DRAM. It's used in lots and lots of laptops, for example. So that's one end of tampering, real kind of, this is not your granddad's type tampering. You need to really know what you're doing. The other end is simple as, oh, I wonder what happens if, and finding that actually there is a way through the control. So the point I'm making is don't assume tampering requires huge brains and masses number of tools. Repudiation. Look for situations where people can deny being able to perform an action. So suppose I have changed something and I shouldn't. How do we know that's the case? And if we think somebody did it, is there some way that they can plausibly deny that they did it? So a common problem with repudiation is around auditing and logging. Are there ways of disabling auditing and logging or damaging it in some way such that I can perform some actions and then deny I did them, and actually there's no evidence? So a really common problem with this is around audit logs. What should a database do, high transaction, full-on volume database do, if its audit log fills up? That's actually not a trivial question, and that came up at a database vendor I used to work for many years before. In fact, I was in engineering, but it was still in the folklore. So they shipped the beta version of the product out, and this was database used by big banks, right, for high volume transaction systems, Wall Street, middle of the trading day stuff. They said, well, clearly if the audit log fills up, we better keep going. So we'll suspend auditing, raise a high priority alert, and just keep going until it got to the first Wall Street bank that went, you've done what? Just stop the database. Clearly, stop the database is the secure thing to do, but it also prevents the availability of the system. So there's a direct conflict there. Information disclosure, that's clearly just breaking into information. Think about how people can get at information. Once information is on screens, for example, it's very hard to control. Are you worried about the fact that people can extract information from screens and put it somewhere else? If you've got an offshore service center with a vast number of people who are constantly coming and going, and there's sensitive information on the screens, and they've got some way of extracting that information, and I'm only talking copy and paste, and putting it somewhere else that they could get to it later, that might be quite a big problem. I mean, that's a really simple information disclosure threat. And at the other end, it's things like, can people work around security controls, cryptography, and so on. Denial of service, we've talked about some of the obvious ones. There are many, many ways to get systems to stop service, such as, if they're configured in a particular way, filling their audit logs. An elevation of privilege, that's examples of situations where people manage in some way to become a user that they shouldn't be. So for many years, people have tried on Unix systems to find ways of becoming root via the set user ID bit, which we're all familiar with. That's quite a big security vulnerability in Unix, actually, that bit, which is why almost all security scanners look for files outside well-known directories that have it on. It's probably a problem. And you know that's a well-known way of doing it on Unix systems. The elevation of privilege tends to be a problem with the security model. There tends to be a sequence of actions that nobody really thought anybody would do, or that nobody thought about, that by some strange combination of logic means you end up with higher privileges than you were expecting. So for example, have you got role-based access control in your systems? And you've got stuff in the systems with business logic based on the roles? It's not uncommon. Yeah, and so are all of your roles totally disjoint? Might be. I suspect some of them might not be, because late in development somebody went, yes, but I'm special, and I need. And so you've added a bit to the role-based security control. You need to go back, and I'm sure you have, but when doing that, clearly it's very important to analyse the possible interactions of roles that people can have to check that people couldn't end up with privileges they shouldn't have. Now, I've seen that in real systems, where business logic says, if I've got this role, allow them to do this. And it really should have said, if I've got this role and not this, or some other condition doesn't hold, don't allow them to do it. Because a role was being reused, in effect, for two slightly different situations. So then, once you've found your threats, you need to write them down, which is not, again, very difficult. It's often made to sound very difficult, and people go and try and buy software systems to allow them to do threat modelling. You just need a copy of Excel, which you've all got. These are trivial examples, they fit on the slide, but actually real ones aren't that much bigger. All you need to record is what kind of threat you found, which component of the system it applies to. That goes back to your model. One of the things it's well worth doing back here, this was possibly too many slides to go back through, is when you do that architecture model, decide what are the pieces and what they're called. I know that sounds simple, but it may not be a one-to-one mapping of the components you found. I don't go into this here. Shostak and many others, Ross Anderson and others suggest, identifying what they call domains of trust. It's a slightly subtle idea, which, like I say, is slightly weird. But I wish I had mentioned it now. I haven't finished the thought. A domain of trust is effectively part of the system, which from a security perspective is all the same. So you might say the database is a domain of trust, even though you've got multiple schemas and you've got kernel databases, but you view always one domain of trust. You might view, if you've got two different sorts of middleware server running in the system, they're both separate domains of trust. Or you might decide it's all one domain of trust. You want the same security model across the two. So once you've identified those bits of the system, give them clear names, clear short names, so you can use those in your models later. And then you write down the threat, as to what might happen, maybe with a bit more detail on this. And then you start to think at this point about mitigation. I mean, typically here, these are JIRA tracker numbers, and you raise a JIRA, say, here's the threat we found, we think the mitigation is probably this, track a number, put it in here, then you can track how many things you found and whether you've mitigated them yet or not. Does any of this sound difficult? You will look at me blankly. I hope that means, no, move on. Hopefully it doesn't sound terribly difficult. The tricky bit is this, really. It's finding the threats and having any idea that you might be done with that process. The other thing is, I suppose, making sure that the threats you found are ones that are worth mitigating. We'll talk about how to do that in just a couple of slides' time. Because you do get people engage in this, because it actually becomes quite fun after a bit, thinking, what could happen? So people go, suppose we've got somebody who exploits that memory bug Google found, and then they subvert the bootloader on the communications device, and then they insert code into the communications device, and when they send a packet, then the communications device creates a packet of death and sends it to our server. And say, yeah, it's kind of possible, but I think we can probably leave that one, because the chances of somebody actually managing to exploit it are very low. On the other hand, somebody tampering with JavaScript in your browser, that's like a non-zero probability, right? And we'll look at that in just a minute. The other thing you can do, apart from starting from the threat side, is to think about the attack side. An attack tree is a very simple idea. It sort of comes from safety engineering originally. If you think about who cares about your system, so type of attacker, professional attackers, CryptKitty, annoyed DBA, mad end user, customer with a grievance, all those kind of things. You figure out what they're after, then you can think about how they might go about an attack. And you can organise it into a tree structure. So, for example, if you want to get stuff out of the database, then you could either go for the database or you could go for the people. And if you went for the database, you could go for the database via simple passwords, or you could go for an operating system vulnerability, or you could go for a database vulnerability, or you could go for an application vulnerability that let you into the database. You see that there's a number of ways that you can achieve that goal. These are more refined goals, and each of those may have multiple options too. So each of these are possible attacks. So that's the database, it's the people, then sort of passwords, operating system, database software. The database software, you could attack the database software itself, or you could attack the client. So you can classify this stuff. There's two ways you can use an attack tree. Well, there's probably any number of ways. There's two ways I have found attack trees useful. One is they're quite good for brainstorming because you start to get down the tree and your brain's focused into one area. So I have found that, especially very technical people like yourselves, the attacks tend to start flooding into your head because you've narrowed the context enough that suddenly your neurons work the right way. You can fan the tree out quite easily. The other thing, though, you can do with it is you can simply use them to organise the attacks you've got already and possibly find more. So when you're finding attacks, when you're thinking about your threat model, you can just start putting them in trees, and that helps to just kind of organise them. The great thing about attack trees is that they allow you to decide to ignore large groups of threats, classifications of attack quite quickly, because you can prove things at a higher level than the leaves. The threat model's all kind of working at the leaf level, really. This is organised into a hierarchy, and you might go, that's not going to happen, or if it happens, we're going to live with that risk, that's fine, and you prune off a whole bit of a tree. That's a good thing about attack trees. A problem with attack trees is if you're using them for analysis, if you miss a top-level node, you've clearly missed an entire gamut of attacks against your system. So there is a bit of a danger with them if you use them the way the books tell you to use them, which is start at the top, figure out the top-level possibilities, then figure out the sub-possibilities and so on. If you've missed the top possibility, you've missed an awful lot of stuff. And because of the way that they get your brain to work, you probably won't think of the leaf-level ones. So just be aware of that concern, is that you do need to check that you haven't missed an entire bit of a tree. But they're really useful in terms of, because they're also easy to write down, you can put them in Excel really easily. They're useful for organising rather than categorising, organising a lot of this attack information. Yeah. It's just trying to find the space, really. It's not really prioritising. It's that, I guess, the hierarchy is about how abstract. So access the database is more abstract than access the database by cracking the password. So it's about classifying, finding the space. In fact, I think the next slide is, once you know what the possibilities are, then think about the prioritisation. The rule of thumb being, earlier in the process, just write everything down. Doesn't matter, right? There's no cost to writing it down. You're not going to mitigate all of these. Write everything down and then think about what's credible and what's not. It's worse to miss something than to spend an extra 20 minutes writing some more threats down. So the way that you can do this prioritization, I should say, so it's called the DREAD model because it's a game, I think a game from Microsoft, that OWASP are actually the place that I go for my definition because it's on their website. That stands for the damage that the attack will imply, how reproducible it is, how easy it is to exploit it, how many users would be affected, and how easily discovered the attack is. Should immediately say, Microsoft, I'm told, no longer use the DREAD model. It would be fair to say that it's a bit heuristic, and security academics hate it because it's not nearly rigorous enough. I think that all those criticisms are probably true, but given that it's pragmatic and it's a useful thought experiment, and actually you shouldn't use the output of any one of these techniques without thinking further, I still think it's really useful. I do know, people do use this every day, and it's definitely useful. There are more sophisticated models if you want them. The MITRE Corporation, for example, which I'll mention that under resources, have got a very sophisticated threat assessment method, which you could use that, but they're also much harder. So people tend not to do them if they've got very many threats, because then they just don't have time. So I think dread, my caveat is, it's not 100% consistent. You do need to think after you've done it. You do need to validate the outputs. Don't use it blindly. But I do think it's a good mental model for thinking, is this more important than this? So what you do is you look at each of these, and I'll leave you to go to the website to get the details. For each one, there's a little scale from 1 to 10. Damage is things like level 1, there is very little damage. It's easily rectified. 10 is, it's just put us out of business. And 5 is in the middle, and there are very simple scales. And you can, to be honest, assign your own scales. None of this is science. It's simply a heuristic that someone sat down one day and wrote down based on their experience. So you can assign your own scales. But they do give you some standard dread value scales on the website. Then you just add them up and divide by 5. 5 is clearly simply a magic number because there's 5 elements to it. There's no magic to the 5 either. So you get a mark out of 10. How simple is that? So it's definitely useful for figuring out which of these risks are really worth worrying about. Because otherwise you are just left sort of qualitatively going, yeah, I think that one's quite serious. So suppose you've got a threat where I've done this scoring as if I was following the OWASP scoring system. There are a couple of them out there. So if you've got a threat where the damage is only going to affect individual users rather than your entire system population, you give that 5 out of 10. If it's reproducible just with a browser, you don't need root access, you don't need a Linux VM to attack from, you don't need anything clever, just a browser, you give that 10, because anybody can do that off their desktops. But you actually need to get malware onto a user's machine or into their browser from the exploit. You give that 5 out of 10, because that's not trivial to do. That's a little bit harder. And it will affect many, but not all users. The difference there is that this is, for example, it affects 2 browsers out of 4. So you give that 5 out of 10. And can you find out about it easily? Is this a very obscure thing that only people working for MITRE and the NSA know about? In which case you give it 0 in that case, I suppose. Or it's a thing that only closed circle of security professionals who go to DEF CON Black Hat really know about. That's probably a 2. If you find it via a quick Google search, that's a 10. That's pretty serious because everyone's going to find it. So in this particular case, I've said, yeah, this is a threat that it's really easy via Google search. That's 10. So I add them up, and this particular risk scores 7 out of 10. That doesn't mean anything. However, if you do this with a dozen risks, they'll all get different numbers. It gives you a way of figuring out a rough ranking, which you then may tweak because you've got your brain switched on. Thinking is still required, as I say at the bottom. But it does give you a mechanism for figuring out which ones we're going to go and look at first. So it's a bit like getting your product owner to prioritize stories in your backlog. No one pretends that's a scientific process either, but it's really useful. So this is much the same. The other thing you might want to do with dread is, if you do have a corporate security group, they will know dread. Definitely. It's in all the books. It's been blogged about a lot. You might just invite them for an hour session. You say, here's all our risks. We're now going to dread them and figure out which ones to look at. And they might just sit in with you and go, yeah, I know what you mean, but actually I think this is much better known than you think it is. I'll give this an 8. And then you add them up and they look at them with you and say, yeah, the way the models come out, they're ranked 1, 2, 3. Actually, I think risk 3 is much more serious. Let's put that at the top of the list. They'll just use their professional experience to give you a hand with that. That can be a really useful thing. And also, because it's security technology, it's a good way of meeting the security group and building a few bridges there. You don't necessarily need to start from scratch if you want to think about threats and risks. There are a number of people in the world who think about these things all the time. OWASP, who again, some of you I think have come across, they maintain what they call the top 10 list. These are the risks, the threats, if you like, that they feel are most significant for web applications. And remember that about OWASP, they only worry about web applications, so not, for example, thick client, internal enterprise stuff. But for web applications, they maintain a top 10 list. There are a couple of guys who are very well known in the field who are responsible for this. It's one of their projects. And every couple of years, I think every year they review the list and they make a decision whether they need to change the ranking and add or remove entries. The last time they decided to add or remove entries was 2013. And I think it's probably the case, it'll probably stay through 2015 and that there might be a new one next year, but who knows? It'll just depend how the security landscape changes. The nice thing about the OWASP top 10 list is it's really well explained. There's a very nice website, there's a crib sheet, there's click through to really good wiki pages that explain the threats in quite a lot of detail and have got very solid advice on mitigation. There is another organisation called the Web Application Security Consortium. I have no idea if these people are friends of OWASP or hate OWASP or split off from OWASP. They seem to be trying to do largely the same thing, except that OWASP appears to be a bit more grassroots. It's a lot of individuals who feel strongly about this, and many of them are independent consultants. Though some of them are in a personal capacity but work for very large firms like Cisco and Microsoft. And whilst it seems a little bit more corporate, there seems to be more corporate backing for it, so I don't know if it's a political thing. They try to do much the same thing, but they also have a thing they call the threat classification list, which they update occasionally. I'd say WASC is a little bit less active, maybe. But it's kind of similar to OWASP, but it's worth having a scan over. The two lists are pretty similar. The area that's different is MITRE. The MITRE Corporation are a US, they're the equivalent of what we would call a crown corporation. They're one of these organizations who, they're a company, but they're sort of owned by the US government. They don't have private shareholders. And they do technical work, I think all technical work, for the US Department of Defense. One of the things that they've done for many, many years is looked at IT security. They have many lists, actually. If you go to their security pages, you'll be overwhelmed by the amount of information MITRE give away for free, which is great. The two you want to go and look at, you might want to go and look at, are CAPEC and CWE. Do any of you get the CERT advisories? I'll talk about them at the end in resources. Basically, every week, the Computer Emergency Response Team put together a list of the new vulnerabilities this week. It's quite hair-raising how many come out every week. Just this week, there were 11 new vulnerabilities in Adobe Flash-based products. That arrived on my desk last Thursday or Friday morning. I thought, really? You've had a good week, Adobe. They're nearly always up in the top 10, but 11 in a week. Wow, that's quite a week. CWE is the Common Weakness Enumeration. That is, it's a set of standardized language identifiers, really, which CERT and others use to classify and tag vulnerabilities, so that we all know we're talking about the same one. And MITRE's own list is called the Common Attack Pattern Enumeration and Classification. You'd almost think they work for the US government, which is known in universities as CAPEC. It's considerably more onerous to go and read and understand and use than especially OWASP. OWASP is very accessible. If you're going back now and you want to give your developers advice, you're trying to get them interested in this stuff, don't point them at CAPEC on day one, point them at OWASP. What you might want to do is talk to your corporate security group about CAPEC. Do we use it? Presumably you're aware of it. Should I be looking at it? Are you looking at it for me? You know, it's very valuable. It's more aimed at the professional security engineer than it is that OWASP are very keen to reach developers, and it's all about reaching the development community. One more technique I'll mention in passing is, do many of you use some sort of user stories or use cases in your development process? Quite a lot of you? Yeah. There is a related idea. So the Agile community calls them abuser stories, and the use case community calls them abuse cases. And they're any kind of use of the system which is negative. The security community has picked these up, and in some cases, people have found them quite useful to take a functional model and then augment it with the set of threats described as stories. So the advantage of describing them as stories is you get a bit of a scenario. You tell a story, as opposed to just having a dry one-line description. And that can help people understand the real threat, the real implications, how seriously they should take it. It sort of brings it alive for people. You know, you can use people's names in the description and all of that. I have never seen someone actually draw one of these diagrams. People just create a list of them. But clearly for training and for conferences, it's nice to have a picture. So, you know, in theory, you do a use case diagram and put more bubbles on it. I've never seen anyone do that. So, for example, abuse cases, you know, you describe the threat. You say the preconditions. I mean, what has to be true that this is really a threat? That's very useful because if the preconditions are very difficult to meet, you can probably knock the threat out. Then what actually happens? I mean, tell them a story. In fact, you want to use more text than this. This fits on a slide just about. I suspect at the back you can't read it, but it just about fits on a slide. Tell them a story. Flesh out a real scenario. Get them interested. And then, the post-conditions, which might be better to call them the implications, what really happened. And in this case, this is actually telling a happy story. This is how the system will correctly respond to an abuse case and mitigate it. But of course, you can have other abuse cases where the story is a sad ending and everybody's very sad and bad things happen. And that's useful because that motivates people to go, oh yes. I find this very useful with business people, actually. I don't produce lots and lots of documentation and kind of hand it to them. I more tell them a story. It's true that we're well inside the corporate firewall, and it's true that we cannot trust our employees. However, suppose that, and then, and what if, and imagine the implications of that, and they kind of go, yeah, got it, let's move those stories to the top of the backlog. Yeah, let's get that done this sprint, because you kind of brought it alive a bit for them, and it's all just about communication, rather than real technical stuff. And certainly in some banks that have suffered rogue trading incidents, the business suddenly became much, much more interested in security terminology and security mitigation than they had been before. So then we've changed, you see, from analyse to mitigate now. Two big things in mitigation, which I'm not going to talk that much about mitigation actually, is minimising the attack surface and mitigating it through technology. So now this is where you actually get to the point where most teams start, which is, what are we going to do with the technology? Minimising the attack surface, though, is about avoiding work rather than bringing more technology into the problem. The attack surface is the number of ways into your system. So broadly, it's the attack vectors. If you've got a small attack surface, and again, this is security jargon, so I will use it repeatedly, because your security teams will as well. If you've got a small attack surface, it kind of makes sense that there's less to attack. Therefore, there's less that has to be secure. It's just about avoiding work, avoiding waste. If you can minimize the attack surface, you've got less security to worry about. The analogy in the big wide world is, if you can make a tank smaller and to have less surface area, especially on the side view, you've got less of a target for someone to go and hit. And it's just the same in a computer system. OWASP have got a somewhat abstract definition, but it works well enough. It's quite general. If you figure out what all the channels into and out of the system are, so that's RPCs, files coming in and out, messaging, web requests, all those things, in and out, and the code that secures those, checks it's from the right person, decrypts it, all that stuff. And then you figure out what data sits in the system that anyone would care about. As we said earlier, you do need to think a little bit beyond simple commercial value. There may be value in things as a stepping stone elsewhere. And then the code that's wrapped around that data to keep it secure, that's basically your attack surface. Because if you don't breach any of that, you won't have achieved anything valuable, even if you do damage something else in the system. So that's your attack surface. What the implications of this are that you simply have to reduce your interfaces, your protocols, the number of services you offer. Which of course, that's a bit of a snag, isn't it? Because what do we spend all day doing? Adding services, protocols, and interfaces to make our systems powerful, reliable, and accessible. It's a little bit like the analogy that I started my career, as you can tell from my grey hair, quite a long time ago, back in the 1990s. I worked with the systems administrator then. I'm an old dyed-in-the-wool Unix guy, really. Sorry, I know most of you are .NET. And this was the early days of Unix. And he was a very good systems administrator who'd come off the mainframes. He was a real Unix expert. He used to run our development Unix systems really, really well, very impressive. But Malcolm was very funny. He always used to say, everything was running fine until you all started using it. And Malcolm's approach was, he could run the systems perfectly well. It was the users who kept messing them up by filling up his disk space and using his CPU and filling up his memory. If you can take that approach to security, it's much easier. You just don't have any remote procedure call interfaces. A whole class of security threats goes away. The snag is obviously that's not actually useful because no one's getting any use out of the system. So it's all very well saying minimize the attack surface. I'm standing here just saying, just do it. Hopefully you're thinking, that sounds really hard to do. And you'd be right, it's really hard to do because it's in direct conflict with every stakeholder in your system apart from those interested in security, of whom They tend to be a fairly small number. What you can sometimes do is use this as a really good argument for tidying up technical debt. So when you're changing the interfaces in and out of your system, what do you typically do? I'm guessing you've got, say, old-style XML RPC coming in, sort of web services, and you've got a new JSON over HTTP maybe, so a REST-based interface, and I'm guessing you keep them both running in parallel for a bit, and then actually, after 3 or 4 months, the plan was the WS style was going away. Did it go away? Didn't go away, did it? That's one of our sad stories. Because every time we put it at the top of the backlog, the business user went, where's the business benefit? And he went, well, it's not direct, but it's causing us problems. Everyone need to change it. We change it twice. It's all a bit of a pain. And they went, yes, whatever. Anyway, I'd like my tax calculations. So you do the tax calculations. This is a cast iron argument for getting rid of old interfaces, because they are attack vectors into your system and they increase your attack surface. And in fact, the older they are, the worse it is, because there's less likelihood of that software being kept up to date, patched, everyone being aware of vulnerabilities on it. Apart from the community that really specialises in old software are professional hackers. They know old software really well because they know it's unlikely to be patched. And if they can find a vulnerability, often by reverse engineering it, that vulnerability is probably going to be really valuable for quite a long time until everyone gets around to patching old stuff they don't care about. Whereas the shiny new stuff gets patched really fast because it's often got bugs in it. So it gets patched anyway and improves security on the way through. So then the bit where most people start is security countermeasures. Countermeasures just means the technology, typically, that gets in the way of security threats. So once you've got a prioritized list of risks, you can then figure out what mitigations, what countermeasures you want to put in place. I don't talk about those in this talk. If there's demand, I'd be interested in coming, or maybe at Software Architect, running one a lot more about countermeasures, because it's a really interesting area. You can't do both in one talk. I tried to mix the two at Software Architect last year. If anyone came to that talk, we both ran out of time and also ran out of brain space, because people were thinking about threat modeling, and then I started talking about countermeasures, and their brains kind of got a bit overextended. But the important thing about mitigations is, bear in mind that there are 3 fundamental groups of them. There's the simple stuff. Clearly, if you don't want people to have access to things, you can put role-based access control in place. Has anyone here not got role-based access control? Just as a matter of interest. No? So nearly every system's got it. You know how to use it. There are some things you've got to be aware of, not introducing covert channels, as we talked about earlier, with having roles overlap in odd ways, but it's pretty well understood. Some are much more complicated than that, but quite well known. Checking for all of your input validation to avoid denial of service, cross-site scripting and injection attacks, that's quite a bit harder. Now, how often have you used FXCOP? And FXCOP has flagged up a potential problem with formatting or parameter validation or overflows, and you thought, oh, actually it's spot on. I just didn't think of that. Why? I should validate that. They're well known, but they can be quite a lot more complex, and you may well need tool support or maybe use hardened libraries to give you a hand in just keeping the amount of effort under control so it doesn't explode in terms of adding to the system. The real problematic set are custom solutions. And that's where you've got a security problem which is not common in the world, maybe to do with your organization, its technology, its process, whatever, and you've got to build your own countermeasure. That should have, I should really put a flashing red light beside this. That's where potential dangers leak in, because stuff that's well known, it's well tested, you've used it many times, you're confident using it. This stuff, you're into uncharted territory, and being sure that you're solving something in a secure way is much more difficult. And we'll talk about that briefly under validation. And the other thing to bear in mind is, don't just fix it with the technology. Make sure that people aren't the weak link, and that the processes around the system aren't the weak link. For example, if you keep your database very secure, but you export, if SQL Server, if you do a backup of the database, BCP on the database, unencrypted, you put it on a file system, and you leave it sitting there on a file system that maybe not the world, but many people have access to, you've got a really significant threat. And that's not a threat to do with technology, really. You can solve it with encryption, but really you've got as much of a process problem there that you're leaving unprotected data lying around. Or giving people access to it when they shouldn't know. The other area of mitigation is incident response. I'll keep moving now because we're starting to run out of time. Your systems will get breached and you need a plan for what to do when it happens. The best example recently was a large media company, starting with S, who clearly did not have an incident response plan when they got attacked. You will all remember it was all over the papers for quite a number of days. And it was very clear from what was coming out of that large firm, they either didn't have a plan, which would be quite surprising, or they didn't have a standing team who knew what to do. Because they flapped around for about 24 or 48 hours, then they started to send out misleading information, and eventually about 3 or 4 days in, I suspect they got external help, incidentally, somebody arrived and went, right, here's what you've got to do. And they went, okay, got it. Now we'll go and talk to the press again. We'll kind of call the people who were affected, etc., etc. You don't just need a plan, you need people who know what to do. And remember, it's going to involve technical people. It's also going to involve senior managers who are ultimately on the hook for this, especially if you're a publicly listed firm. You cannot exclude them because they may be going to prison. You've got to have your legal teams involved to understand what the legal implications of what has happened are. If you've lost credit card details and you're PCI DSS certified, your legal team need to know, like, the minute you know, because they need to get on the phone to some other legal teams and other firms to start discussing what the implications are. And finally, as certain large companies have discovered, not having good communications in place is disastrous because the press will fill in the gaps where you don't supply them with the facts. They may not have facts, but that never prevents them publishing copy, especially in this 24-hour news cycle. So you need a plan and you need to practice it. It's like BCP, disaster recovery. Who practices disaster recovery? Please nod. You all do. I know you do. Just the same with this. It's probably not even the technical folks. The non-technical folks need to get in a room and pretend they've had a security breach and figure out what they'd really do and actually practice it and think it through. Because that's when they'll find the gaps in the plan. What happened the first time you did a DR test? Go on, admit it. It was a fiasco, wasn't it? Nothing worked, and then you couldn't fail back, and you lost a backup. And it's happened to us all, right? It's happened to the best organizations the first time you do it. Practice makes perfect. And then finally, you've got to build the thing securely. I don't really talk about secure implementation because it's a big and specialist area. It's fairly well understood, but it's not simple, as I keep trying to explain to business managers and our clients. It's understood. That does not mean it's easy. The two things that you normally need are static analysis. Anyone use static analysis regularly for security? Yeah, good. And you'll be needing expert code review. Most security standards require human expert review as well as static code analysis. And there are lists of guidelines you can get. Don't think of your own. The top things people make mistakes are they don't validate input, so they get injection attacks. And that's the second one, injection attacks. The first one is more general. For example, they get denial of service attacks because people send them huge strings, which they then try and format into log messages, which then fill the log up and bring the system down, for example. Insecure randomness. Cryptography relies a lot on random numbers. If you can predict the random number sequence, and you're a cryptographer, clearly, it's an awful lot easier to break somebody else's cryptography. If you don't know what the list of random numbers was, it's much, much harder. I mean, orders of magnitude harder. I mean, many orders of magnitude harder to break the crypto. The basic random number generators in most platforms, including .NET and Java, are fundamentally repeatable sequences. They are printable sequences. That's why both systems have a cryptographically secure random number generator. Make sure you're using it. That's the kind of thing a static analysis tool will find for you. They will always look for insecure randomness. Don't build your own crypto. I've many, many years ago thought that I would be quite interested in cryptography and try to design crypto algorithms. Gosh, that was a baptism of fire. Never again. I was working for a big security systems company, and we had real security experts who just took the stuff apart. You could crack it in seconds. It was quite sobering. It's really quite hard to do crypto well. And it's not just crypto. It's kind of security technology in general. Don't build your own. Be careful what you log. You find this all the time. People log sensitive stuff out to logs and then don't protect the logs. Really, really common. That's a PCI DSS requirement as well. They will always go and check for that. And careless exception handling, where, for example, you swallow exceptions. How is that security related? A great way to do a denial of service attack is to launch an attack such that exceptions are triggered and then swallowed and ignored. Because people don't know that they're under attack, and you can quite possibly overload a system that way. And finally, not testing the thing from a security perspective. Have you got unit tests for your security? It's okay, you don't have to say. If you haven't, run, don't walk. Go and build some. They're quite tricky, aren't they? Build unit tests for security. It's pretty important, though. And finally, testing and verification. Like anything else, to make sure that your system actually is secure, you need to test it. That it itself would be an interesting talk as well, because it's quite a big, wide area. Some of it's relatively straightforward, and you can do it yourselves. Some of it, you need to use specialist knowledge and skills and tools. That's things like static analysis. That's things like having the OWASP checklist to guide you through your own code. And some bits of it, it's quite unwise to try and do yourself, because there are specialists in the field. But also, you get massive benefits from a third party looking at your system and going, I bet they hadn't thought of that, because you hadn't, because you'd all thought together that something was true or secure or insecure or whatever. The validation activities are static analysis, that's using a tool to scan your code and pick up common patterns, which may not be a problem in this case, but have proved to routinely be a problem. Does anyone use Fortify, for example? It's one of the canonical ones. Clockworks, if you use C++. There are FX copies, not a security scanning tool exactly, but it's got a lot of security checking in it. There are quite a lot of static analysis, both cloud services and stuff that runs on your desktop and stuff that runs in your continuous integration pipelines. It's well understood. The snag with it is most of it costs money, because these static analysis tools are quite expensive to develop. Paratest would be another company who for many years have produced static tools. You need to do some functional testing of security features. I'm a huge advocate of doing this automatically, so that's when you're using cucumber tests for security as well as for functions, also unit tests around stuff. But I'm also of the opinion this is where having automated a lot of testing, having some expert testers do exploratory testing for security, that's a jolly good idea too. Because obviously, how do you build a test? You build a test with a model in mind of how the thing works, with positive and negative cases. Exploratory testing is where the testers go in and think, you wouldn't normally do this, but I just wonder, with a negative number in that field, and then finishing the order and then cancelling it, I just wonder, would I get money back on my credit card? Oh, what do you know? Or, no, I don't, but I crashed the system. Who knows? But there's all kinds of... The important thing is it's a functional testing with security mindset rather than a does it work mindset. Then there's the area where I think you sort of get on to getting the specialists involved. Penetration testing, which is where people try and attack your system from outside, normally from a huge cloud-based environment which tries to overload it. Searching it for known vulnerabilities. That's those lists, like the MITRE list, like OWASP. Some tools will do it for you, but there's a lot of small third-party consultancies who know these lists really well. They've seen it all. They've made the mistakes themselves. If you need a secure system, they can be of tremendous service because they sort of know what they're looking for. The snag the first time you do that is you're not quite sure what you're looking for, and it does take some time. If you've got some guys in your teams who are really enthusiastic about security, brilliant, get them on it. On the other hand, if nobody cares that much, you might need help. And fuzz testing is where you test the system with random inputs. So it can be useful just functionally in reliability testing, but for security, it's one of the standard security building blocks is you bombard a system with lots of random inputs, and they can be completely randomized, or they can be seeded with what you might call credible, but not correct inputs. Bombard the system with those, especially libraries they do this with, just see what happens. If you get exceptions out of it, if you don't get any security violations, if you get through to screens that you're a bit surprised about, then that all raises red flags. Just as you might do a design review, you might do a design review for security. In fact, you probably should do a design review for security. That's something where if you've got a corporate security team, that can be a great way of kind of interacting with them. Rather than them coming to you, telling you what to do, you approach them and you say, we've taken security into account, we think we've done an okay job, but now we'd like some expert input and review. You'd be surprised how often corporate security teams then appear not to respond very quickly. I've never quite figured that out. Either they're not quite as confident as they sounded, or they, for some reason, don't want to get involved, but press them. It's a good way of getting a relationship with that team. But also, clearly, they should know a great deal about designing secure systems. And then finally, threat mitigation tests. That's where you have identified some threats. Make sure you've got a test for those particular threats. And those sometimes those are going to be custom manual tests. Again, maybe you get a third party to do, or you understand them, so you can probably do them internally. But for goodness sake, if you've got a threat and you think you've mitigated it, make sure you've got a test route. Key thing about all this is, I've just gone through a very long list of activities. Unless you're in the secure systems domain, which I used to be, and we could pretty well justify, within reason, any amount of security testing because security was a key quality property. I suspect most of you don't work on secure systems, is that right? You work on mainstream systems that need to be secure. You probably can't do all this, certainly not indefinitely, because it's slowing everything else down. So you need to be looking at these, where are my biggest risks and threats? Where's the return on investment? Where do I really need to focus? Because you won't get to do it all. It's now just about 11 o'clock and I think I'm meant to stop. So I have a set of design principles for secure systems, which I'm not going to go through, but they're in the slides. What I'm going to do is just take you quickly to the summary. When you're designing systems, there are some very well understood principles. These are not mine, I haven't just pulled these out of my head. They're my words, but they're very commonly cited principles for secure system design. They're very tested. Things to bear in mind, just to take away and use with your teams. Always assign the least privilege possible. Don't give somebody root access because it's easy. Don't make people supervisors because it works around a functional problem. Compartmentalize stuff. Compartmentalize things. Separate responsibilities out. Make sure that if you've got access to orders and access to payments, that you don't inadvertently give the orders people access to payments that they shouldn't have. Build as much compartmentalization in as the business model requires. I mean, do the order people want the payment people to be able to change orders? Probably not. So you need to build separate security domains there. Use the simplest thing possible. And obviously this is good for many reasons. Arbitrary complexity is a bad thing. In the security domain it's particularly important because what have we looked at today? We've fundamentally been having to understand the system to do threat modeling, to identify risks and to mitigate them. The more complicated something is, the harder that is. And that goes back to the attack surface argument. The more complicated, the more stuff you've got, the harder the task. Audit your sensitive events. You need to know when something has happened in your system, and the audit log needs to be tamper-proof. And when things go wrong, like my audit log example, fail securely. Don't fail into an insecure state. The other thing is, if any of you work on products, package vendors, because when your stuff comes out of the box, make sure you've got secure defaults. Not having security should be a choice. Make sure people are switching security off, rather than saying, here you go, you're insecure, good luck. Just switch all the security on, because they won't. Or if they do, they'll only get half of it right, because you're the experts in your product, your system. They probably do not yet understand it all. Be very careful who you trust, especially when you're connecting to external systems. Don't assume that port 80 on this machine is necessarily the person you think is on the far end. Make sure that you're authenticating that somehow. And for goodness sake, don't rely upon obscurity. I'll just show you one slide because I just thought the picture was very funny. I got this off Google, but it's a warning, this mainframe is protected by obscurity, which is kind of what many people have relied on for many years. This is really hard. No one's ever going to guess this. What do you know? People are smarter than you think. I love the comment as well. What the hell is a data set? That's for MVS people. So don't rely on people just not stumbling across stuff. The security principle is you assume the attacker has perfect knowledge. Now you don't share that knowledge with them clearly, there's no point making it easy, but assume they've got perfect knowledge because that forces you to design a secure system. Implement defense in depth, which is this one here. You don't just put security in your middle tier. You need a secure browser, you need a secure middle tier, you need a secure database, and when we talked about even partitions in the data, there may be parts of your database that need more protection than others. Clearly things which are very personal, medical records, they've got to be very secure. You might want to encrypt those. Credit card numbers, you might want to encrypt in the database or have in a separate database which has got far tighter access control. So don't allow a failure at one level to allow people straight through to the goal. Make sure that they've got a problem every level they go through, because it clearly slows them up a lot, and even if they're skilled enough to do it, they're going to set off a lot more alarms on the way through. You're much more likely to be secure. And finally, find the weakest link. Keep thinking about where's the weak bit, and it's often the people, because the weak bit is actually how secure you are. It doesn't matter. The security analogy is there is no point building a castle with a huge front wall with a moat in front of it and having paper walls around the back. That's the mental model. Is that if the people are insecure, if you've got an operating system security problem, there's no point having a secure app on top of it, and so forth. I know it's sort of obvious, and you're all thinking, yeah, we get it, move on. But actually, that's a very common problem in real secure systems, is that there are weak links in the chain that no one's really thought about, and they often involve links to third parties. I mean, how hard is it to set up a secure link in your firm between two systems? Probably not that hard. You've got a certificate authority, you can install certificates, you've got automated systems. How hard is it to do an authorized link to a third party? Quite a lot harder, right? Swapping certificates, checking they haven't been compromised, doing revocation, checking certificate chains. That's often the kind of area where you get a much weaker link, and actually your system is as secure as that link. Unfortunately, not all the secure links. So we've looked at how to improve system security, in fact, how to make systems secure. And the key point to take away is it's all about risks. It's people, process, and technology, not just, I've got SSL, therefore I'm done. And you need to really design it in. It's really rather hard to add later, which I think you already know because you're all working developers. That's quite a hard thing, in my experience, to explain to business people. So they think, well, just do all the functions and then do the security on top. Done. Because after all, you can add more functions. Why can't you add more security? Actually, it's rather hard to do. We want to be guided by risks and use risk modelling, stride and dread being great mental models for how to organise it. And for really significant risks, none of us in this room are real experts. We all need to find the real experts to give us a hand when we've exhausted our knowledge. I put resources in the slides. Take a look through those. Most of them are very accessible, and I think you'll find some value in them. And I've also linked to some books, which some of them are old. Don't be fooled thinking an older security book from the early 2000s is no longer valuable. It depends on the kind of book. If it's about threats in the C++ compiler, clearly it's of much less value. Many of them, though, like software security, building security in, they've still actually got an awful lot of valuable information about building secure systems. It's just some of the technology examples they use are a bit outdated. The principles are still there. The most up-to-date book here is 24 Deadly Sins, written by the same guys who wrote that one, and that one, and that's their most recent book. That one's bang up to date and talks about recent Java and Microsoft technology. That's me. I suspect we haven't got a lot of time for questions, so thank you very much. I'll be around for the rest of the day if you want to follow up on anything. Thanks for your attention. That was a very successful attack. So security is the business of managing these risks, and it's really a type of insurance. I mention that because that's the analogy you use with especially your business managers, when they're saying, this all looks a bit complicated and expensive, couldn't we just not do so much of this? And you say, yes, we could do less of this, and then we'll run more risk. And I always just say to people, do you have house insurance? Because it's an unpleasant bill that comes through the post once a year, and you have to pay quite a significant amount of money. If they're a senior manager, after all, presumably they've got a big house, so they'll have a big insurance bill. Do they pay their bill? Of course they do, because they want to mitigate the risk. It's the same with building security into your systems and development processes. It's balancing cost and effort, which we don't like, against the risk of loss, which we also don't like. So we've got to balance those two. And some of, this goes back to the fact security people are kind of in their own little world. There's a number of key terms which I'll use this morning, though I'll keep explaining them if you need me to, but security people often don't explain them. The four key things are resources. That's the stuff people care about. That's things of value normally. They need protection. There are actors, and they're also called principals. Those are sort of substitutable. Principals or actors, they're the people or things that interact with the system. They can be good or bad, depending on their motivation and maybe their context. Some of them may be good some of the time and bad other times. Policies are the rules you'd like to enforce, such as no one else can see my email. That's a policy. Well, that's a rule in a bigger policy, I would think. And finally, the threats, which is what we're really going to talk about this morning, that's the reason that people may break the policy rules, and that's how the policy rules might get broken. After all, in a perfect world, what would you do? If everyone was entirely honest, you'd simply write the policy down and give it to people, and then they'd follow it, because it's a perfect world. We know that doesn't happen, and that's why we need security. you're secure because you're catching a certain number of attacks on your boundary from people who don't care very much, because you're not really under sustained attack. And the reason this is becoming more important is, as our head of digital likes to say, every company today is a digital firm. I mean, who here hasn't got a website? That is a rhetorical question. I know you've all got public-facing websites. And they're getting bigger and more important, so more services are hanging on the public internet, so security is becoming much more important. What I observe, though, time and time again, and this is not in the last couple of years, this is for well over a decade, is that when I work with development teams, they often start with the security technologies rather than asking questions about the security of the system. So when I ask people about security, they say, I'm using single sign-on and we're going to use Spring Security. None of which is necessarily wrong. In fact, they're probably both good decisions in the right context. But they don't tell me very much about whether the system is secure or not. And there's also, even among security professionals, sometimes there's a fixation with tools around the software development lifecycle. Does anyone here use Fortify, for example? FXCop? .NET must use FXCop, yeah. Tripwire, Find Bugs, all those kind of tools. Again, many of them are very good. They've got a lot to offer, but they're not the be-all and end-all of checking your system secure. Any security expert, and I'll tell you in a minute, I'm not really a security expert. I kind of bluff my way as a security expert. I'm really a systems architect who's now a CTO. Any security expert will say is, you need to figure out what risks you face, and then you figure out how to mitigate the risks. And it's at that point you worry about the technology. Nearly all teams I talk to, when I ask them, Spring Security is great, I think very solid bit of technology, what risk are you mitigating? They do look at me a bit blankly, and they go, well, we were told it had to be secure, and we had to control it, so we've used Spring Security. But there may be any number of risks they're facing that Spring Security is utterly irrelevant for, or maybe they're using it in a way that doesn't address them. So technology is important, it's only part of the solution. And in this talk, we're going to talk about risk-driven security. The caveats are, it's a pretty introductory talk. No one's going to leave here as a qualified security engineer. I'm sure you weren't expecting that. In fact, I'm not a well-qualified security engineer. As I say, I'm a software architect. I do think, though, that means that I can communicate with you about security in a way that often security teams don't. How many of you work in a firm with a specialist security unit, where you've got IT security people, and when you talk to them, how does that communication generally go? That's not a rhetorical question. Because in my experience, it doesn't tend to go very well, because often IT security people have got a view of the world, because they're real experts. They've been doing this stuff for decades, and they're qualified in it with lots of specialist qualifications. And developers know security is kind of important, but frankly, they've got a system to ship, and the two teams tend to talk past each other. And that's one of the things that people like me are trying to bridge the gap a bit, along with many more famous people than me, like Adam Shostak, who's doing a great job at that as well. So what is security? Security is about having dependable systems. And we need systems that are dependable in spite of the fact that, good morning, malice, error, and mischance exist in the world. Or to put it in a snappier way, people are bad, stupid, or unlucky. And security is how we mitigate the risks of people being bad, stupid, or unlucky having a bad effect on us. The key point is that anything of value in your system, that's of value to anyone, may attract unwelcome attention. Clearly, if I was to leave £500 in £10 notes here, and I left it, now all of you clearly would hand it to security immediately, but if I just left it in an empty building and came back a week later, the chances of it still being here are slight. That's because it's of value. It's much the same with websites. One of the things I say to big corporates is, one of the reasons you may not be seeing all that many attacks is because today there's not a tremendous value in attacking you. And so we try and look at the value of resources to people to figure out what kind of unwelcome attention it might get. And we care about this because all of these things imply some kind of a loss. Time, as in time out of a market, money, people stealing stuff, privacy, talk to Sony, people leaking information they really didn't want to share with the rest of the world. In fact, clearly their CEO didn't want to share it with the rest of the company, never mind the rest of the world. Reputational damage, again, Sony, but lots of big banks are quite concerned about this. If they have a website defaced, what does that say about their IT security? It's a big reputational impact. And finally, gaining an advantage over somebody. Does anyone know, in fact, you may all have read about it, but what's one of the classic attacks on an auction system, like eBay, that requires no security knowledge, no security hacking, no special technology? and it's about gaining advantage in the auction process. What's one of the best attacks on a naive, anyway, auction system? Bingo. Yes. Simply trying to use people's accounts with dummy passwords to lock their accounts, and then hoping that they will have to relog into the system in some way. Of course, after many password attempts, systems often invalidate cookies anyway because they think something's going on. Somebody tries to log back in, and their account's been locked. Now, if you time that right in an auction, and it's the person bidding against you whose account that you've tampered with, you've gained an advantage. And arguably, you've gained money and time as well, and those things. But a key thing is you've gained an advantage in an interaction between two people. And that's not a very sophisticated attack. Back when I worked in the Bay Area during the boom, that was one of the problems eBay had early on. They didn't have a good mitigation for that, and some people figured it out very, very quickly. And there was a huge spate of people attacking eBay, who now I think have got very sophisticated mitigations against that attack, as other auction sites do too. But in the early days, when we were all a bit naive, okay, I think we'll get started. It's absolutely fine if people wander in a few minutes late. In fact, one more person. I often run sessions myself, so I have no position to be looking at people. I'm Eoin Woods. I'm the CTO of a company called Endava, an IT services provider. So many companies are, 2,000 of us. I've been working with security since, I suppose, the early 2000s, when I worked in internet security in particular. We'll talk about that in a minute. We're going to talk today, about 90 minutes, about security. The thing that may surprise you, or maybe if you've read the abstract you're expecting, we're not going to talk very much about security technology. We do have a slightly longer version of this talk, where I talk a little bit more about the technology. But my very strong thesis, which the kind of security industry I think agrees with, is that if you don't get the fundamentals right, you end up using a lot of security technology and not being very secure, which is the worst possible outcome. So we're going to talk today about all the things you need to do before you worry about which is security technology you're going to run to solve the problem. It's a fairly small session, which is really good. We don't like the big ones where you can't see them. So please interact with me through. If you disagree with me, do tell me. I'm very open to being disagreed with. All the engineers in the dialogue disagree with me regularly. If I'm asking a question, it's not rhetorical, just jump in with an answer. It's much more interesting for everyone. So to start with, security is quite difficult, but it's also quite important. I have this view, dealing with some of our clients, many large industrials have absolutely no idea of the cybersecurity threat they face today. My thing I always say to them is, you think you're secure because you haven't yet annoyed Anonymous. The day you annoy the Anonymous collective, you'll find out how good your IT security is. You think